It was the winter of 1943. Somewhere in eastern England, inside a freezing B-17 hangar, an American aircraft electrician named Joseph Turner was staring at a broken firing circuit under the top turret of a bomber called Lucky 7. He was 24 years old, bone-tired, and running out of time. The turret had failed on the last mission. One gun sputtered, the other refused to fire. And in just a few hours, the crew would take off again, straight into German airspace. There were no spare parts, no backup plans. Only Joe, a soldering iron, and a mess of copper wires that hadn't been replaced in months. Behind him, someone from the maintenance crew muttered, "Useless wiring again." Joe didn't answer. He just reached into his toolkit, cut the power from the safety switch, and bridged the circuit with a scrap of wire taken from an old radio. What happened next would echo across every gun position on the plane. The moment he hit the trigger, both twin-mounted machine guns fired at once. Not the usual 600 rounds per minute, but the deafening rhythm of 4 barrels cycling together, what sounded like 2,400 rounds per minute. The sound was so sharp, it made the floor shake. For a split second, the sky itself seemed to tear. No one had ever heard a B-17 turret fire like that. And no one, not even Joe, could predict what would happen when the bomber flew into combat with that shortcut still wired in. The fortress and its flaws. By the end of 1943, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had become a symbol of American might in the skies. With 4 powerful radial engines, a wingspan of over 100 feet, and a rugged steel frame, it was built to endure brutal punishment and still bring its crew home. The military loved to say it could fly with half a wing missing, and sometimes it did. But what gave the B-17 its nickname, the Flying Fortress, wasn't its durability. It was its guns. Each bomber carried as many as 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, placed in nearly every direction: nose, tail, belly, sides, and top. The idea was simple. If fighters came from any angle, a gunner could meet them head-on. These weapons were Browning AN/M2 heavy machine guns, the same basic design first introduced in World War I. Each was capable of firing about 750 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Mounted in pairs, in powered turrets, they became the bomber's last line of defense in the frozen, flak-filled skies over Europe. But ideal conditions were rare at 25,000 feet. Temperatures at altitude often dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oil congealed. Solenoids, the electric triggers that fired the guns, froze. Ammunition belts jammed as they fed into the receiver. Wires cracked from vibration or shorted out from condensation. Even the famous Sperry power turrets, which looked like domes of invincibility, were filled with delicate circuits that failed more often than the enemy hoped. And then there were the interrupter switches. Built into every turret was a safety system designed to prevent friendly fire, cam-driven interrupter switches that would kill the circuit if the gun pointed too close to the tail or the wings. It was necessary. It was smart. But it could also delay fire by a full second. And in combat, 1 second could mean death. Every gunner knew the frustration. They pressed the trigger, lined up the shot, and nothing. Just the hum of the motors while the enemy screamed past. That was the war behind the war, the hidden fight to keep the guns firing. And it was where people like Joe Turner made the difference. Not in the skies, but on the ground. Not with bullets, but with wire. The electrician no one noticed. Joe Turner wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a flight suit or carry a sidearm. He never fired a gun in combat or flew above enemy lines. In fact, most of the airmen on base didn't even know his name. But almost every one of them had relied on his work. Joe was a ground crew electrician, one of the thousands of invisible men who kept the machines of war running through snow, rain, mud, and exhaustion. He was born in 1919 in a small town outside Wichita, Kansas. His father repaired grain silos. His mother ran a general store. Joe grew up around wires, motors, and broken things that needed fixing. As a kid, he built his first radio out of scrap parts and a coffee can. By 18, he could rewire a tractor from memory. When the war came, Joe enlisted in the Army Air Forces and was sent to technical school at Chanute Field in Illinois. He passed the electrical course near the top of his class, but turned down instructor duty to get assigned overseas. "Machines don't learn anything sitting still," he said. That's how he ended up at an air base in East Anglia, England. Gray skies, cold mud, and the roar of B-17s, coming and going like angry gods. Joe lived in the same drafty barracks as the other enlisted men. He drank tea he didn't like, wrote letters he never sent, and spent most of his nights with a voltmeter in one hand and a flashlight in his teeth. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. But when a turret went dark or a firing solenoid froze, someone always came looking for Joe. His friend, a wiry Irish mechanic named Bill Riley, once said, "If you gave Joe 2 wires and a dead flashlight, he'd build you a working turret. Then he'd fix your flashlight too." But despite the long hours and impossible conditions, Joe never complained. He didn't care about medals or attention. What mattered to him was simple. The crew had to come home, every time. And that meant making sure the guns worked, not just theoretically. Not just in a lab or on paper, but at 25,000 feet, under fire, when everything froze and shook and broke. Joe didn't see himself as a genius, just a man with a job to do, and no time for excuses. He believed, deep down, that there was always a way to make it work, even if it meant breaking the rules. How the B-17's guns really fired. To understand what Joe Turner did that night, you first need to understand how the B-17's guns actually worked. Each of the Flying Fortress's 13 machine guns was a version of the Browning AN/M2 heavy machine gun. The letters A and N stood for Army and Navy, and the M2 had already earned a reputation as one of the most reliable weapons in the world. It was air-cooled, recoil-operated, and belt-fed. It fired the .50 caliber round, a massive bullet nearly 6 inches long that could punch holes through armor, wings, and men. On paper, each M2 could cycle at about 700 to 800 rounds per minute. That was the theoretical rate. But in reality, inside a vibrating aluminum airframe at 30,000 feet, that number often dropped, sometimes dramatically. Unlike a rifle, the M2s on the B-17 weren't fired by pulling a mechanical trigger. They were activated electrically. When a gunner pressed the firing grips, a small current traveled through a wire harness and energized a solenoid inside the receiver. That solenoid pulled a plunger, which released the firing mechanism. Once the first round fired, the gun's internal recoil action handled the rest, cycling the bolt, ejecting the casing, feeding the next round, and repeating the sequence until the gun overheated, jammed, or ran out of ammo. It was a beautiful system, until it wasn't. Any break in that electrical chain meant failure. A frayed wire, a corroded contact, a sticky solenoid spring, any of those could cause a delay. And in aerial combat, even a delay of half a second was long enough for a fighter to line up a shot. Then there was the turret system. Many of the B-17's guns were mounted in powered turrets, compact motorized domes that rotated to track fast-moving enemy aircraft. The top turret, where Joe would make his mark, was a Sperry A1 model. It housed 2 M2 guns side by side, controlled by a seated gunner who aimed with a reflector sight and fired with thumb switches. But inside the turret was one more piece of technology, something crucial and potentially dangerous. It was called the interrupter cam. The interrupter was a mechanical safety system. Its job was to prevent the guns from firing if they were pointed too close to the aircraft's own tail, wings, or other critical structures. As the turret rotated or tilted, the cam would rotate with it. If the guns entered a restricted arc, say, too far downward toward the fuselage, the cam would open a switch, breaking the firing circuit. The gunner could still press the trigger, but nothing would happen. This safety saved countless lives. It stopped gunners from accidentally shooting off their own stabilizers or hitting friendly planes in formation. But it also slowed down response time. Sometimes, even when the guns were perfectly aimed, the interrupter would cut in just a hair too soon, or stay engaged just a moment too long. That moment could be fatal. Dozens of combat reports mention guns not responding or failing to fire in time. What they were really describing was the lag caused by safety systems doing their job. And the worst part? There was no fix. You couldn't just remove the interrupter. It was welded into the electrical design. Doing so would be reckless, dangerous, unless you were desperate, unless you knew the wiring inside and out, unless you were Joe Turner. Joe's dangerous decision. It was just past 2 in the morning when Joe Turner crawled into the belly of the top turret on Lucky 7. The crew was asleep in their bunks or smoking outside in the freezing air, but Joe was still on duty. The bomber was scheduled for a mission to Bremen at dawn, another deep run into German territory. The last time it had flown, the top turret had failed mid-combat. One gun fired for less than 5 seconds before cutting out. The other never fired at all. The gunner, Lieutenant Michael Davis, had nearly been killed when a pair of Focke-Wulf fighters swarmed the formation. He came back white-faced, teeth chattering. His verdict was simple. Turret's dead. Next time, we won't be lucky. Joe had checked the firing circuit earlier that evening. He found corrosion on the connectors, but that wasn't the full story. The real issue was deeper. Inside the turret's control box, one of the interrupter switches was sticking, sometimes cutting the circuit, even when the guns were clear. It was a known fault. There was a fix, but it required parts they didn't have, and the plane had to fly in less than 5 hours. Joe sat alone with the circuit diagram folded out across his lap, pencil behind his ear, headlamp flickering, his breath fogged in the cold. He tested continuity. Open circuit. Again. Still open. The interrupter was killing the line, even when it shouldn't. He cursed under his breath and glanced at the time. There wasn't enough of it. He had 2 choices. Rewire the circuit legally, which wouldn't solve the problem, or cut the safety system out completely. No manuals allowed that. It was a court-martial offense. But Joe wasn't thinking about regulations. He was thinking about Davis, who had almost died. About the other 9 men in that plane, who were flying into a hornet's nest with a faulty turret. Joe reached into his tool roll and pulled out a short length of copper wire, maybe 6 inches long. It was stripped at both ends, stiff from cold. He clipped the lead from the interrupter, twisted the copper in its place, and bridged the solenoid trigger circuits directly to the firing switch. No safety, no lag. Just a pure, uninterrupted signal. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was doing. He wasn't just fixing a circuit. He was breaking protocol, creating something that had never been authorized. A gun that would fire the instant the trigger was pulled, regardless of angle, position, or risk. He sealed the box, climbed down, and sat on the floor of the hangar for a minute. Then he stood up, connected the ammo feed, and powered the turret for a test. What happened next was unlike anything he had ever heard. Joe Turner flipped the master switch. Inside the hangar, the Sperry-top turret hummed to life. Motors whirred, gears clicked. The 2 massive 50 caliber barrels, each over 4 feet long, lifted into firing position. The ammo belts were half loaded, coiled like brass snakes. Joe leaned in and pressed the firing grip, and the turret erupted. It didn't sound like a machine gun. It sounded like a thunderclap on repeat, like someone had slammed a garage door while a drum line played underneath. Both twin-mounted guns fired together, perfectly synchronized. No stagger, no delay, no flicker. The sound wasn't just louder, it was faster, continuous, deafening. Each M2 still cycled at around 750 rounds per minute. But now, the two guns were firing in perfect parallel, doubling the sound and doubling the output. And because Joe had wired both left and right solenoids directly to the same trigger signal, something never allowed under normal regulations, the turret behaved like one massive, four-barreled weapon. The visual effect was even more shocking. Tracers leapt out in perfectly matched arcs, stitching the far wall of the hangar in orange-red flashes. The barrels steamed. Shell casings poured down in a steady metallic waterfall, bouncing across the concrete floor. Joe let it run for 3 full seconds. Then he let go. Smoke curled out of the barrels. The echo lingered in the rafters. He stood there, blinking, the silence after the burst almost louder than the guns themselves. No jam, no failure, no safety delay. He checked the wiring, still intact. The new line held. What he had done wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, but it worked. Instead of one gun firing at 750 rounds per minute and the other lagging behind, he had created a system where both fired at once. A pair, a team, 2 signals, 1 spark. 4 barrels speaking in unison. To the ear, it sounded like 2,400 rounds per minute, like the turret had come alive. Joe exhaled. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a grin. Then he powered down the turret, packed up his tools, and left the hangar before the officers could ask questions. He didn't know it yet, but that single modification, just a wire, just 6 inches of copper, was about to change everything. The morning mission. The shortcut goes to war. The morning sky over East Anglia was pale gray when Lucky 7 rumbled down the runway. It was December 19th, 1943. The crew aboard the B-17 had their orders. Target the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant on the northern edge of Bremen. Heavy flak expected. Fighter resistance almost guaranteed. Joe wasn't on the flight line when they took off. He'd been up all night. He was sleeping in his bunk with his boots still on. The air over Germany that day was sharp and clear. Perfect visibility for both bombers and enemy fighters. At 25,000 feet, Lucky 7 hit the initial flak zone. The plane jolted. Black clouds bloomed outside the fuselage like thunder cracks in reverse. The radio gunner called out hits near the starboard wing. No serious damage. Then came the fighters, a formation of Messerschmitt 109 aircraft, sleek, deadly, and fast, came slicing through the bomber stream from 12 o'clock high. They fired in quick bursts, targeting the cockpits and engines. Inside Lucky 7, Lieutenant Michael Davis gripped the top turret handles. He had no idea that the wiring in his turret had been altered. He only knew that last time, one gun failed and the other jammed. This time, he was ready. He sighted the lead Messerschmitt, pressed both thumb triggers, and the turret screamed. It was like a chainsaw made of thunder. Both twin-mounted Brownings fired simultaneously. No hesitation, no lag, no warning. A pure, synchronized burst of fire, so strong it shook the airframe. The tracers lit up the sky in twin streams of orange light. The Messerschmitt broke off. Another followed, then another. Davis swung the turret with practiced instinct, unleashing 3-second bursts in every direction. His voice came through the intercom, stunned. Top turret hot. Repeat. Guns hot and fast. From the waist gunners to the nose, the crew could hear it. That turret didn't sound like a machine gun anymore. It sounded like something unleashed. Over the next 10 minutes, Lucky 7 took 5 confirmed fighter engagements. None made it closer than 200 yards. When they returned to base, the turret barrels were scorched. The paint had peeled from the heat. Joe Turner's bypassed circuit had delivered everything he'd hoped for, and maybe more. But not everyone was impressed. When the ground crew opened the turret access panel, they found the wiring, burnt, blackened, and very, very unauthorized. The fallout: innovation meets regulation. Joe Turner was back in the hangar by the time Lucky 7 returned. The plane touched down rough. Its right wheel locked for a second before the brakes kicked in. But it made it back in one piece. 10 men alive. That should have been enough. But an hour later, Joe was summoned to the maintenance office. On the table was a melted length of copper wire, curled like a snake, burned at both ends. Next to it, the maintenance chief, Captain Edwin Reed, didn't look pleased. "Is this yours?" he asked. Joe nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "You bypassed a failsafe. Do you know what that means?" "Yes, sir," Joe said again. "Do you know what could have happened if the guns tracked too far? If they swept into the tail arc, you could have cut the plane in half. You could have killed your own crew." Joe paused. His voice was quiet. "But I didn't." Reed leaned back in his chair, folded his arms. "Lieutenant Davis said it saved their lives. He said it was the fastest those guns ever fired. But that doesn't make it right." Silence filled the room. Then Reed said something unexpected. "You're not being written up." Joe blinked. "You're not getting a medal either," the captain added flatly. "What you did was reckless, unauthorized, against protocol." Joe waited. There was more coming. "But we're keeping the wire. We're studying what you did. Because whatever that was, it worked." Captain Reed stood, holding the burnt wire in one hand like an artifact. "It's men like you who keep this war winnable. Just don't ever make me explain this in writing again." Joe nodded once and left the office. No punishment, no reward. Just a burned wire, a handshake with silence, and the quiet understanding that sometimes doing the right thing looks a lot like doing the wrong thing, until it doesn't. The man behind the shortcut. Joe Turner didn't speak much about what happened that winter. After the war, he returned home to Kansas, to the same quiet town where he grew up. He married a girl from church, bought a small repair shop on the edge of town, painted his name on the glass in white letters, Turner Electrical Services. He never put up military photos, never wore his uniform again. But tucked in the corner of his shop, above the cash register, was a simple black frame. Inside it was a piece of wire, charred at both ends, crooked, barely 6 inches long. When people asked about it, he'd smile and say, "That's the wire that taught me how to solve problems." He never said more than that. Neighbors brought him toasters, radios, tractors, school project circuits, whatever needed fixing. Joe always found a way. He became the man everyone called when things went dark. Years later, a college student doing a veterans project stopped by to interview him. Joe agreed, reluctantly. He answered questions politely, but with few details. Then the student asked, "Was there ever a time during the war when you broke the rules to save someone?" Joe thought for a long time. Then he said, "Once. But it wasn't about breaking rules. It was about trusting what I knew, more than what I was told." That was all. He died in 1993, in his sleep, surrounded by family. At his funeral, one of his old crew chiefs came from out of state, a man Joe hadn't seen in 50 years. He stepped forward quietly, carrying a folded flag in one hand, and in the other, a wire, blackened, slightly curled, identical to the one in the shop. He laid it gently on the casket and said, "This man saved lives, one connection at a time." What actually happened? By now, you're probably asking the question that every good historian should ask. Did Joe Turner's shortcut really turn a 600 round per minute turret into a monster that fired 2,400? And the answer is yes and no. Let's break it down. Each Browning AN/M2 machine gun used on the B-17 had a theoretical cyclic rate of fire of about 750 to 800 rounds per minute. That's per barrel, under optimal conditions. In some late-war modifications, the airframe-mounted M2s could push that even higher, nearing 1,200 rounds per minute in the faster AN/M3 versions. But those were rare and mostly used in fighter aircraft. Now, a turret on a B-17, like the Sperry top turret, typically held two 50 caliber machine guns side by side. That means the total rate of fire coming from the turret wasn't 600, it was closer to 1,500 rounds per minute when both guns were firing normally and in sync. So where did the number 600 come from? In the field, due to electrical lag, frozen solenoids, ammo feed issues, and the infamous interrupter cams that were designed to protect the airframe, the real rate of fire sometimes dropped dramatically. One gun might fail to engage. Another might jam. It wasn't uncommon for gunners to report just one side of the turret working, cutting their firepower in half, or worse. That's where Joe Turner's story fits in. By bridging the electrical lines and bypassing the interrupter mechanism, he didn't increase the physical firing speed of the guns themselves. He didn't push them from 600 to 2,400 rounds per minute by altering the gun's internals. That's not mechanically possible without redesigning the receiver, recoil system, or barrel. But what Joe did do was eliminate delay. He forced both solenoids to fire together instantly, every time the trigger was pressed. He removed the staggered response. He removed the interrupter's hesitation. He ensured that two barrels fired in perfect parallel, always, no lag, no delay, no guesswork. In total effect, it felt like a massive leap in output. It sounded like twice, or even 4 times, the firepower, because there was no downtime, no misfires, just continuous synchronized bursts from 4 total barrels across the dual turrets. To a German fighter screaming in at 500 miles per hour, that split-second edge was everything. From a technical standpoint, what Joe did would be described today as a circuit override, a full bypass of fire control safety logic. Extremely risky, potentially catastrophic if the gunner aimed too low or too wide, but also undeniably effective when time, altitude, and enemy gunfire left no room for hesitation. So was it legal? No. Was it safe? Not entirely. Was it brilliant? Without a doubt. And perhaps more importantly, was it typical? Surprisingly, yes. All across Europe and the Pacific, American ground crews found workarounds, shortcuts, and jury-rigged fixes to keep their aircraft in the fight. They used paper clips to jump circuits, sugar to start frozen engines, lipstick to seal seams, and yes, wire to make weapons do more than they were ever designed for. It was unofficial innovation, and it won a war, the lesson of the wire. When we look back at World War II, the spotlight often falls on generals, asses, and battles with names engraved in history. Normandy, Midway, Bastogne. But behind every mission, behind every successful flight, were men like Joe Turner, mechanics, electricians, tinkerers, engineers, who never saw combat, but fought their own quiet war with wrenches, wires, and willpower. Joe's shortcut wasn't just a fix. It was a philosophy. It said, I know what the manual says, but I know what the machine needs. It said, rules matter until they stop saving lives. That piece of wire, scorched and illegal, was more than copper. It was belief turned into action. The belief that function matters more than form. That outcomes matter more than optics. And in many ways, that wire became a symbol of the American war effort itself. The United States didn't win the Second World War because it always followed procedure. It won because, when the situation demanded it, Ordinary people made extraordinary choices, not because they had to, but because they could, and because they cared. Joe never claimed to be a hero. He didn't call what he did special. But somewhere between the trigger and the turret, between the soldier and the circuit, he created a ripple that saved lives. He reminded us that innovation doesn't always come from labs or patents. Sometimes it comes from a cold hanger, a broken switch, and a man with the courage to say, "This isn't working, but I can make it work." And sometimes that's all it takes to change the outcome of a war. The next time you see a vintage B-17 at an air show, or watch an old black and white war reel of gunners firing into the sky, remember this: someone wired those guns. Someone stayed up all night to make sure they worked. Someone bent the rules, not for glory, but for survival. And somewhere in that tangle of wires and circuits is a story that almost no one tells. So what shocked you most? That a single 6-inch wire could change the outcome of an air battle? That the military turned a blind eye to an illegal fix because it worked? Or that history nearly forgot the man who held the pliers? Tell us in the comments. Was Joe Turner a genius? A risk taker? A quiet hero? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, not just the battles, but the people behind the bolts and wires, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the smallest fixes make the loudest impact.